He started out as an unassuming teenager in a small Mexican town. Years later, people feared only his codename, Z42. He was the man who murdered, extorted, and paralyzed entire cities for Los Zetas. In this video, you can see how Omar Treviño Morales rose to become Mexico's most wanted cartel boss, and how he was ultimately brought down. Omar Treviño Morales was born in 1974 in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, a border town where legal and illegal businesses often went hand in hand. He grew up in a large family, attended school regularly, and did not stand out in any particular way, either positively or negatively. Neighbors later described him as quiet, polite, but with a gaze that scrutinizes you. His older brother, Miguel Angel Treviño Morales, known as Z40, would later play a decisive role in his life. At first, Omar stayed out of trouble, working odd jobs to support his family. But the environment in Nuevo Laredo was permeated by cartel activities, and it was only a matter of time before he was drawn in. The decisive turning point came in the early 1990s. Omar was in his early 20s, and his brother, Miguel Angel, was already working for the Gulf Cartel, where he rose rapidly through the ranks. At that time, the border town of Nuevo Laredo was one of the most important smuggling routes for cocaine into the U.S., and a powder keg of corruption, violence, and organized crime. Omar himself started out doing small favors. He delivered packages, transported cash, and drove vehicles from one side of the border to the other. Officially, he was a sales representative for cattle transport. Unofficially, he was learning the logistics of the cartel business. The turning point came when a close friend of his was shot dead in a dispute over contraband. The killers belonged to a rival group. For the first time, Omar saw how quickly a conflict in this world could end in death, and that the only safety lay in being on the strongest side. At that time, the Gulf Cartel began to transform. Its armed protection force, which would later become known as Los Zetas, specifically recruited men who were willing to carry out orders without hesitation. Many of them were former soldiers from the Mexican elite unit Cartel. But loyal civilians with the right temperament also had a chance, and Omar had something that stood out: unconditional loyalty to his brother and a willingness to take risks. Through Miguel Angel, Omar gained direct access to this new formation. Initially as a helper in the background, then increasingly on the front lines. He drove armed convoys, transported high-ranking members, and learned how operations were planned and secured. From that point on, there was no turning back. He was no longer just the little brother of an aspiring cartel boss. He was a soldier in the making of one of Mexico's most feared criminal organizations. Omar Treviño Morales officially joined the ranks of Los Zetas in the mid-1990s, when the group was still operating in the shadow of the Gulf Cartel. The original Zetas were an elite unit of renegade soldiers, men who combined military discipline with criminal efficiency. For outsiders, there were few ways in and even fewer ways out. Omar's acceptance was not only due to his brother Miguel Angel, who by then played a key role within the organization. Omar had proven himself reliable, discreet, and willing to carry out orders without hesitation. In a world where mistrust could be deadly, that was worth its weight in gold. His training differed significantly from normal cartel initiation. He received paramilitary training, which took place on remote ranches and in improvised camps. There he learned marksmanship, explosives handling, kidnapping, and interrogation techniques. Ex-soldiers from the ranks of the Cartel taught the recruits combat tactics, convoy protection, and urban warfare. At the same time, Omar was introduced to the Zetas' psychological warfare, the deliberate spreading of fear to control rivals and the civilian population. It was not just about defeating opponents, but terrorizing them. Messages in the form of public executions or narcomantas, banners with threats, were part of the standard repertoire. His first assignment as a full member of the Zetas was a training mission, securing a smuggling route to Texas that was threatened by a rival syndicate. Within a few weeks, he showed that he not only carried out orders, but also found his own solutions, often tougher and faster than expected. With each mission, his influence grew. Within the Zetas, he was soon no longer just the brother of Z40. He was Z42, a code name that came up in radio communications when it came to sensitive operations. If this true story grabs you, then leave a like and subscribe to my channel. That way, you won't miss any more revelations about the brutal world of cartels and their most feared men. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Los Zetas was no longer just the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel. It was a power in its own right. And Omar Treviño Morales, now known as Z42, began to emerge from his brother's shadow. His rise began with jobs that no one else wanted to take on. He was the man they sent when a problem had to disappear without witnesses. In cities such as Reynosa, Nuevo Laredo, and Monterrey, he carried out targeted operations to eliminate rivals and secure control of routes. Omar understood early on that an enforcer doesn't just use violence, he stages it. Every action was also a message. If a dealer refused to pay protection money, he would be found the next day in a public place, along with a narcomanta, a message on behalf of the Zetas. Rivals were not only defeated, they were publicly humiliated to discourage others from resisting. He led small teams that were structured like the military, clear chains of command, defined roles, precise time frames. He combined discipline with brutal efficiency. Ex-soldiers praised him for his planning, other Zetas for his ruthlessness. Over time, he began to be feared not only within the organization. Other cartels, from the Gulf people to the Sinaloa structures, knew who Z42 was and what it meant when he showed up in their city. His reputation as the man for the dirtiest jobs made him irreplaceable, and that's exactly what gave him power. Whoever controlled the violence controlled the streets, and Omar was on his way to doing just that. By the mid-2000s, Omar Treviño Morales, Z42, had cemented his place at the top of the Zetas hierarchy as an enforcer. His name was synonymous with intimidation. Wherever he appeared, even armed men lowered their gaze. Under his leadership, the Zetas' methods became even more brutal and even more public. Entire cities were covered with narcomantas and bloody demonstrations of power. It was no longer just about killing the enemy, it was about humiliating them in front of everyone. Public places, bridges, and street corners became venues where the Zetas left their messages. One of the most notorious cases under his supervision occurred in San Fernando, Tamaulipas. Rival smugglers who took over a route disappeared without a trace. Days later, their bodies were found in mass graves, an operation that shocked the police and military. Officially, the authorities did not assign responsibility to anyone directly, but in the underworld, it was clear whose handiwork it was. Omar also relied on systematic extortion. Mayors, businessmen, even local police chiefs had to pay weekly protection fees. Those who did not pay risked their families becoming the next target. Even journalists kept their distance, not out of respect, but out of sheer fear. Within the Zetas, Z42 was an authority figure. He intervened in internal disputes, sometimes mediating, and in other cases, letting heads roll to set an example. His loyalty was solely to the continued existence of the Zetas and the power structure he had helped build. During this time, he was no longer considered just an enforcer. He was a strategist, a man who could keep entire regions under control, with a mixture of military planning and ruthless violence. But the greater his influence became, the more visible he became to the authorities, and that would soon become his greatest risk. Until 2015, Omar Treviño Morales, Z42, was at the top of Mexico's most wanted list. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and the Mexican Navy did everything in their power to capture him. Millions in bounty money was offered for his capture by both governments. The decisive lead did not come from an informant within the Zetas, but from months of surveillance. Authorities tracked phone calls, analyzed cash flows, and used drones to identify movement patterns. Omar knew he was being hunted and constantly changed vehicles, houses, and security personnel. On the morning of March 4, 2015, the Mexican Marines struck in an affluent neighborhood of San Pedro Garza Garcia near Monterrey, a city where hardly anyone could imagine that Mexico's most wanted man was hiding. Shortly after 3 a.m., armored vehicles surrounded his hideout. Special forces stormed the building in a precise operation that lasted less than 10 minutes. Omar was caught off guard in his sleep without firing a shot. In a photo that later went around the world, he is seen in sweatpants, his hands tied behind his back, flanked by masked Marines. The arrest was a serious blow to the Zetas. Within hours, government spokesmen announced the success on television, while international media described him as one of the most brutal cartel leaders of modern times. But in the world of drug cartels, the end of one man does not mean the end of the organization. While Omar was taken to a high-security prison, power struggles over his succession immediately began within the Zetas, a process that is often just as bloody as the drug war itself. For Z42, it was the end of his time on the streets, but his story was not over. It simply moved behind concrete walls and steel doors. After his arrest in 2015, Omar Treviño Morales, Z42, was transferred to the high-security Altiplano prison, the same complex from which Joaquin El Chapo Guzman had once spectacularly escaped. Here, the concrete and steel walls were supposed to ensure that Z42 could no longer give orders to the outside world. But anyone familiar with the structures of Mexican high-security prisons know that influence does not end at the prison walls. After just a few months, reports began circulating that Omar was maintaining contact with Zetas members on the street through intermediaries. Family members and lawyers are said to have played a key role in this. The authorities did not officially confirm anything, but in the regions where the Zetas were active, many whispered that his voice still carried weight. Behind bars, he quickly became known as one of the most influential inmates. He maintained contacts with members of other cartels, especially former allies of the Gulf Cartel and individual groups of the Beltran Leyva organization. Some guards kept a respectful distance, while others were suspected of secretly giving him advantages, from better food to uncontrolled visiting hours. His daily routine was structured like a military regimen. Hours of training in the yard, conversations with hand-picked fellow prisoners, meticulously planned visits. Even inside, he acted like a commander who always kept track of everything. Although he increasingly faded from the press, his name remained synonymous with toughness in the underworld. Young recruits who joined the Zetas years after his arrest knew his story from tales told as an example of how far one can rise in the cartel if one is willing to carry out every order. Whether he will ever see the streets again as a free man is questionable, but one thing is certain. Even in prison, Z42 is not easily forgotten. He is part of a legend that will reverberate in the world of Mexican cartels for a long time to come. From an unremarkable young man to Los Zetas' most feared enforcer, Omar Treviño Morales' story reflects the brutal reality of Mexico's drug war. If these true insights captivate you, subscribe now, activate the bell, and check out our complete cartel playlist next. There you'll find more unvarnished stories about narcos, sicarios, and the power structures that continue to shape Mexico today.